What up, my fellow fluffies? Welcome. Today we are looking at the first topic in my Back to Basics series for PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Every video in this series will be mostly useful to new players, but if you are an experienced player, you may still learn a thing or two, so it's worth checking them out. I'm making each of these videos its own topic, and I'm doing them in something of a logical order, so let's start right at the beginning. The first topic is all about the best settings to use if you want the perfect balance between high FPS and high visibility. That is, the balance between smooth gameplay and the ability to see enemy players easier. Because a nice smooth game also happens to make it easier to see enemy players. Now, some of these settings are more important than others. You have my recommendations on screen straight away, just in case you don't want to listen to me explain it all. But if you stick around, I will explain every setting in detail, just for the people who want to know what everything actually does. So let's start from the top. First of all, we have screen scale. You're going to want to keep this on the default 100. Any higher than that, and you're basically playing with a resolution that's higher than your screen, but scaled down, which will make things slightly sharper, but it will lower your frame rate significantly. Next up is anti-aliasing, and this is possibly the most important setting of all. The higher this setting is, the smoother the edges of objects look. I mean, you can test this yourself very instantly when you're in a game just by alternating between very low and ultra. I mean, setting this to very low makes the grass look horribly jagged and it's very distracting. Whereas setting this to ultra, it smooths it all out perfectly, and it doesn't affect your frame rate that much. So it's vital that you set this to ultra. Having everything look smoother makes it far easier to focus on moving objects and players in the distance. Next up is post-processing. This affects how everything loads once the map is already fully rendered. Unfortunately, post-processing is one of the biggest drags on your frame rate, so I recommend that you set this to very low. Next is shadows. Now, this is a point of debate for many people, so I'm going to simplify it with a question. Do you want high FPS, or do you want things to look real and sort of beautiful? Or do you want a balance of somewhere in the middle? Like post-processing, shadows have a big impact on your frame rate, so if you want to be as competitive as possible and you don't care about fancy graphics, set this to very low. Whereas, if you want things to look as nice as possible and you don't mind playing with a lower frame rate, set this to high or ultra. Then again, if you're like most people, I'd imagine, and you want a bit of both worlds, you might want to set it to low or medium. I used to use medium myself, but because I live stream whenever I play, my FPS already takes a hit from that, so I decided to use very low personally. I mean,
I want that high FPS.
Anyway, next up is texture. Now, just like shadows, my recommendation for this is actually variable. And this is because texture doesn't particularly help you see enemy players easier. It does, however, affect your frame rate. Now, I'm more of a competitive player, so I prefer low graphics and a very high FPS. But even I think that the textures on very low in this game are just disgusting. So if you're a bit like me, I recommend medium for texture, just nice middle ground. It's not ugly, and it gives you a decent frame rate. Keep in mind, though, that the better your system is, if you're on PC, of course, the higher you can set this without ballsing up your FPS value. Anyway, the next setting is effects. Now this affects how nice things like explosions look. I'm confused. Effects. So it makes things like explosions look nicer. So, I mean, unless you're constantly throwing grenades because you like how good it looks, or you're sitting in red zones just marveling at the pretty boom, then you should set this to very low. It's just it will help prevent your frame rate dropping when all these effects actually happen. Anyway, moving on. Next up, we have two interesting settings, which actually do the same thing with different objects: foliage and view distance. Both of these settings determine to what distance things will render and appear. Foliage covers trees and large bushes, etc., and view distance covers buildings, barrels, containers, fences, everything man-made, really. But keep in mind that players will render at any distance, regardless of foliage or buildings. So neither of these settings affect your ability to see a person. Also keep in mind that when you aim down a scope, trees and buildings will render as if you are that much closer to what you're looking at. My recommendation, well, it's more than a recommendation, I'm telling you to do it. You need to set both of these to very low. Why? because they massively affect your frame rate. And according to my own testing, I've tested the distances of things appearing and disappearing. With both of these settings on very low, trees will still appear to about 1,000 meters, and buildings will still appear to about 1,500 meters. And that is more than far enough for seeing things with your naked eye. I mean, as I explained, when you look down a scope, these things do appear further anyway, so there's almost no point to having them higher than very low. So set both of these settings to very low, and just marvel at how high your FPS gets. And this is not negotiable. Do it! So then, just to finish off, make sure motion blur is unticked. Motion blur, I've complained thousands of times in the past about motion blur. Motion blur, in my opinion, only exists for consoles to mask the fact that they have a very low frame rate. Totally unnecessary. And actually, in a game like PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, it actually makes it much harder to see players when you're moving your vision around. For the obvious reason that things are getting blurry when you move. That is not helpful. So turn that off. And finally, we have VSync. Now, VSync gets very technical because I'll try and give you a basic explanation. Basically, it caps your frame rate to your monitor's refresh rate. So if you have like an older 60 Hz monitor, your FPS will be capped at 60. And this is to prevent screen tearing. Now, screen tearing means those sort of split-second moments where your monitor is trying to show a frame rate that is too high for your monitor to show. So technically, it tries to show 2 frames in the same moment, resulting in those sort of horrible-looking lines that are out of sync that snap across your screen, and it's ugly. But VSync famously introduces input lag, sort of lag for your mouse movements. And lag to your mouse movements is unforgivable. Unforgivable, especially for a competitive game like this, so you should always turn VSync off. And besides, these days there's actually a newer technology called G-Sync available on many of the newer screens and newer monitors these days. For example, I personally use a 144Hz G-Sync monitor, and G-Sync basically prevents screen tearing like VSync, but it doesn't give you any input lag, so win-win. Anyway, those are all the graphic settings that affect sort of FPS and visibility, but I might as well cover the others. First of all, let's look at the FOV, the field of vision or field of view. Now, this is the kind of game where you're going to want to use a higher FOV. Basically, the higher this value, the wider you can see, sort of like a wide-angle lens on a camera. I personally use the max, as you can see, of 103. I recommend you put it, I mean, the default, I believe, is 80, which is the minimum, and I recommend you put it to 100 and just see what it feels like, and try raising it to the max from there. It might be very odd if you aren't used to using higher FOVs, but trust me, set it high and get used to it. It allows you to see so much more on your screen space, and it is one of the key settings for seeing enemy players easier. Now, the very final setting, which I recommend you try, is Colorblind Mode, even if you aren't colorblind. There are 3 different types, and they don't change all colors, like they're not going to change the color of grass and sky, etc. They only change things like, for example, reticle color. So the red dot sight, the actual red dot, and the markings on the 4x scope, for example, the default color is red. But in one of these settings, it's actually blue. And I actually really like the blue reticles on the weapon sights myself. It also changes the color of the red zone on the minimap, so it's no longer red. I think on one of the settings it's actually yellow. And also, and this is actually can be genuinely helpful, it changes the color of your squad mates' names, making them possibly easier to see. So I recommend, even if you're not colorblind, just to mess about with the different colors. You might prefer like a blue reticle on your weapon sights like me, so give it a go. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope these settings set you on a path for many an ass kicking and many a chicken dinner. If you found this video helpful, subscribe and watch the rest of the videos in this series. Like this video if you liked it, like this video if you didn't like it, and I'll catch you in the next video. Liquid Blitz, out!